Before we start, hit that subscribe to support Battleground Archive. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. When the temperature alarm went off, it was 3:47, and at that moment, I realized that everything we had been told about climate change being gradual and manageable was nothing but a lie, fabricated to prevent people from panicking about what the ice was actually covering up. I am Captain Elias Norwick, and I need to tell you what I witnessed at Thule Air Base before the records are erased and everything is destroyed, before the official story becomes the only story, and before the truth, what we found, what it told us, and why those in charge of the base ordered us to seal off the lower levels and act as if nothing had happened, is buried under levels of secrecy that no one will ever know. I'm recording this in a room that's supposed to be soundproof, speaking into a device I'm not authorized to have, violating oaths I swore and security protocols that came with prison sentences for violation. But silence guarantees that what happened beneath Thule stays hidden, and I've decided I'd rather face court-martial than carry this secret to my grave, knowing that humanity deserves to understand what's waking up as the ice melts. Thule Air Base sits 750 miles north of the Arctic Circle in Greenland, where winter darkness lasts months, and the cold is so severe it changes how metal behaves and how human bodies function. It's officially a radar station and missile defense site, one of America's northernmost military installations, crucial for monitoring threats from Russia and maintaining our early warning network. But that's the public story, the explanation they give to congressional oversight committees and allied governments who ask why we maintain such an expensive presence in one of the most inhospitable locations on Earth. The real reason Thule exists, the actual purpose that justified billions in construction and maintenance costs, has nothing to do with radar or missiles. Thule was built to monitor something we found beneath the ice in 1952, something that had been frozen for longer than human civilization existed, something that the scientists and military officials who discovered it decided needed permanent observation because they couldn't determine if it was dead, dormant, or waiting. I didn't know any of this when I received orders to report to Thule for a 6-month rotation as base security commander. The briefing I got in Washington was standard posting information, climate conditions, personnel management, force protection protocols. Nothing suggested this would be anything other than cold, boring duty at an isolated radar station where the most exciting security incident would probably be a drunk airman picking a fight in the recreation room. The flight up was commercial to Greenland, then military transport to Thule, watching the landscape change from green coastal regions to pure white emptiness. The base itself looked like what you'd expect. Cluster of buildings designed to withstand Arctic conditions, runway long enough for heavy cargo aircraft, radar installations, and that permanent quality of places where humans maintain presence despite nature actively trying to kill them. Captain Helena Fisk, the officer I was replacing, met me at the transport terminal. She looked exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with the darkness or cold, the kind of tired that comes from carrying knowledge you can't share and responsibilities you can't explain. "Captain Norwick," she said, shaking my hand with grip that was too tight and held too long. "Welcome to Thule. I hope your briefing was comprehensive." The way she said comprehensive made it clear she knew it hadn't been, that I was walking into a situation I didn't understand yet. The first week was routine adjustment to Arctic conditions and base operations. I learned the personnel roster, walked the perimeter security, reviewed response protocols, standard duty. But I kept noticing small things that didn't quite fit the official narrative of what Thule's purpose was. There were personnel on the roster whose positions were listed vaguely as research support or technical specialist without specific duties assigned. There were restricted sections of the base that required clearances I didn't have despite being base security commander. And there were temperature monitoring systems throughout the facility that seemed excessive for simple climate control. It was Sergeant Theo Markland who first mentioned the lower levels. We were conducting security rounds during my second week, walking the corridors that connected the base's various sections, when he paused at a reinforced door marked Maintenance Access, Authorized Personnel Only. "You been down there yet, sir?" he asked, and something in his tone suggested the question carried weight beyond simple curiosity. "No," I said, "and that's the lower maintenance levels, correct?" Markland looked at me, and I saw him make a decision about how much to say. "That's what they call it officially, maintenance levels, but some of us have been here long enough to know it's more than that. The temperature readings from down there, they've been changing, getting warmer. And Captain Fisk, before she left, she was spending a lot of time in the secure briefing room looking worried. I should have pressed him for more information. Should have used my position to demand access to restricted areas immediately. But I'd been military long enough to know that some things get revealed when you're ready for them, and pushing too hard too fast usually ends with getting transferred, or worse. The revelation came 3 weeks into my rotation when the temperature alarm system went off in the middle of the night. Not the building climate control alarms, but deeper systems, monitoring something below the base's normal infrastructure. I responded to the command center where the duty officer, Lieutenant Parks, was staring at displays showing temperature data from sensors I hadn't known existed. Deep sensors, measuring conditions hundreds of feet below the base's foundation, in spaces that shouldn't have been accessible or monitored. "What am I looking at?" I asked, studying readouts that showed temperatures rising in what the display labeled Sub-Level 4 and Primary Containment. Parks looked relieved that someone with higher authority had arrived to take responsibility for whatever was happening. "Sir, the thermal monitoring system for the deep facility shows temperature increase of 4.2 degrees Fahrenheit over the past 6 hours. That might not sound significant, but down there, that's massive change. The permafrost that's been stable for decades is beginning to thaw." "What deep facility?" I asked, because apparently my security briefing had left out some fairly critical information about what I was supposed to be securing. Parks hesitated, clearly uncertain how much he was authorized to tell me. "Sir, I think you need to speak with Dr. Vestergaard. She's the science director for the deep facility. She has the clearance to properly brief you." Dr. Hannah Vestergaard turned out to be one of those research support personnel whose actual duties had been left vague in official documents. I found her in a laboratory I hadn't known existed, accessed through that maintenance door Markland had pointed out, descending stairs that went down much farther than any maintenance access should need to go. She was in her 50s, Danish accent still strong despite years in international scientific communities, and she had the look of someone who'd spent too long studying something that troubled her deeply. "Captain Norwick," she said when I entered the lab, "I was wondering when they'd finally brief you properly. Come, I'll show you what you're really here to protect." What she showed me was video footage from 1952, grainy black and white images of an excavation site in the Greenland ice sheet. Military personnel and scientists working around something they'd uncovered during construction of the original Thule facilities. The thing in the ice looked organic at first glance, roughly 10 feet long, vaguely cylindrical, with surface textures that suggested biological origin. But the more you looked, the more details emerged that didn't fit any known organism. Symmetries that were too perfect, structures that looked functional but without obvious purpose, and most disturbing, what appeared to be deliberate containment or housing around the organic core, suggesting this wasn't a natural creature but something that had been built or engineered. "We call it the specimen," Dr. Vestergaard said quietly. "Found buried under 300 feet of ice that dating suggests accumulated over approximately 12,000 years. Which means this thing was placed or crashed or somehow ended up here right around the end of the last ice age." The implications were staggering even before she explained the rest. This wasn't fossil or preserved remains. The tissue samples they'd carefully extracted showed cellular structures that were intact, dormant, but not dead. And the engineered housing around it contained materials that didn't match anything in Earth's natural composition. What happened after they found it? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. They built Thule around it, Dr. Vestergaard said. The entire base, all the official justifications about radar and missiles, they're real but secondary. The primary purpose of this facility has always been monitoring the specimen, maintaining stable frozen conditions, and making sure that whatever this thing is stays dormant. She pulled up current temperature data, showing the same concerning trends I'd seen in the command center. But the permafrost is melting. Climate change, geothermal activity, or maybe something about the specimen itself generating heat. Whatever the cause, the ice that's kept it frozen for 12,000 years is beginning to thaw. And if it thaws completely? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Dr. Vestergaard's expression was grim. We don't know. The last comprehensive study was done in the 1970s when they had better funding and less oversight. The conclusions were classified above my clearance level, but the recommendations were clear. Maintain frozen conditions at all costs. If the specimen achieves ambient temperature, something will happen. What that something's, I'm not authorized to know. The next 3 days were spent implementing emergency cooling protocols, trying to reverse the temperature increase in the deep facility. We pumped liquid nitrogen into the containment spaces, reinforced the insulation systems, diverted power from non-essential base operations to run the freezing units at maximum capacity. Nothing worked. The temperature kept rising, slowly but inexorably, like something deep in the ice had activated and was generating its own heat despite our efforts to cool it. On the 4th day, Dr. Vestergaard called me to her laboratory with urgency in her voice that made me grab Sergeant Markland and head down immediately. We found her staring at a display showing real-time data from sensors embedded around the specimen's containment cell. It's happening, she said. The ice is melting faster than our cooling systems can compensate. We have maybe 12 hours before the specimen reaches ambient temperature for the first time since it was frozen. Should we evacuate? I asked, running through emergency protocols in my head. Pull non-essential personnel to safe distance. But Dr. Vestergaard shook her head. Evacuate to where? If this thing is dangerous, if it's some kind of weapon or organism that threatens human life, distance won't help. And if we evacuate, we lose the only opportunity we might ever have to observe what happens when it wakes up. Markland looked at me, and I saw in his expression the same calculation I was making. We'd sworn oaths to protect, to confront threats, to stand between danger and the people we served. Running wasn't an option, not when we didn't know what we were running from. Then we observe, I said. We document everything, and we prepare for whatever happens when 12,000 years of frozen sleep comes to an end. The containment cell was accessed through a series of airlocks and decontamination chambers that descended deep into the permafrost, well below Thule's normal infrastructure. The temperature dropped as we descended, our breath visible despite the environmental suits we wore, the cold so intense it made the metal walls creak and groan. The final chamber was carved directly from ice and reinforced with materials designed to contain biological or radiological hazards. And in the center, suspended in what remained of the ice block they'd cut around it in 1952, was the specimen. It looked different from the archival footage. The ice had melted enough to reveal more detail, and what I saw made my understanding of biology and engineering completely inadequate for description. The thing was definitely organic. I could see tissue, cellular structures, what might have been neural networks. But integrated throughout were components that looked manufactured, crystalline matrices and metallic filaments arranged with precision that suggested purpose. Is it a creature or a machine? I asked Dr. Vestergaard. Yes, she said simply. Both. Neither. We don't have vocabulary for what this is. biological engineering that makes our genetic modification look primitive, or machine intelligence that evolved beyond mechanical forms. Either way, it's something that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of how life and technology develop. The ice around the specimen was now almost completely melted, just a thin shell remaining around the organic core. And as we watched, that final layer began to crack, water running off the surface, revealing details that had been hidden for 12 millennia. The surface wasn't uniform. It had textures, patterns, and what looked like sensory organs or interfaces. And most unsettling, it had something that could only be described as eyes. Not animal eyes or mechanical sensors, but structures that combined both, capable of perceiving in ways human vision couldn't match. "The temperature is equalizing," Dr. Vestergaard reported, checking her instruments. "The specimen is now at ambient containment temperature for the first time since 1952. If it's going to do something, it should happen soon." We waited in the frozen chamber, 3 humans watching something that might be 12,000 years old, wake from sleep that had lasted longer than recorded history. And I realized that whatever happened in the next few minutes would define the rest of my life, would determine whether humanity remained alone in understanding what was possible or learned that we'd been observed, studied, or accompanied by intelligence that predated our civilization. The first sign of change was subtle, a shift in the specimen's coloration from gray-white of frozen tissue to something with more vitality. Not warmth exactly, but the quality of living matter rather than preserved remains. Then came movement. Not dramatic or sudden, but slow muscular contractions that suggested a biological system, testing its functionality after long dormancy. The crystalline components within the organic structure began to glow faintly, internal power sources activating or responding to external conditions. And then it opened its eyes. The moment those eyes focused on me, everything changed. Not in any physical way I could measure or document, but in ways that affected perception, consciousness, and understanding at levels I didn't know existed. I felt something looking back at me, not with the blank stare of an animal, but with intelligence that was assessing, calculating, and recognizing what I was. The biological sensors throughout the containment cell went haywire. Every monitoring system that tracked life signs, metabolic activity, neural patterns, all of them spiked simultaneously, showing readings that shouldn't have been possible. And then, just as suddenly, they dropped to 0. Every sensor showing flatline, no activity, complete biological silence. But the specimen was still moving, still looking at me with those hybrid eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to something deeper. And in that moment of eye contact, I understood something that would haunt me for however long I had left to live. This thing wasn't our enemy. It wasn't a threat to humanity or an invader from distant stars. It was something far more disturbing and far more complicated than that. And the real horror wasn't what it was, but what it meant about us, about human history, about everything we thought we knew about our species and our place in a universe far stranger than we'd imagined. The sensors read 0, but I could feel its awareness in ways that bypassed instrumentation entirely, like standing in front of something vast and ancient that had been waiting specifically for this moment, for someone like me to look into its eyes and understand what it really was. Dr. Vestergaard was frantically checking her equipment, trying to understand why every biological monitor had suddenly flatlined despite obvious activity in the containment cell. "This is impossible," she muttered. "The sensors are functioning, the systems are operational, but they're reading complete absence of life signs. Like the specimen isn't even there." But it was there, more present and more aware than anything I'd encountered in 20 years of military service. I could see its chest moving with what might have been respiration, could see neural activity flickering through the crystalline matrices embedded in its tissues, could feel the weight of its attention focused entirely on me. "Captain Norwick," Markland said quietly. "Sir, you need to step back. You're too close." He was right. I'd moved forward without consciously deciding to, drawn by something I couldn't explain. I was now less than 10 feet from the specimen, close enough to see individual cell structures in its organic components, close enough to feel warmth radiating from its body, despite the frozen temperature of the containment chamber. The specimen made a sound. Not vocalization exactly, but resonance that came from within its structure, frequencies that I felt in my bones before I heard them with my ears. And with that sound came understanding, concepts deposited directly into my consciousness without the intermediate step of language. Recognition, awakening, purpose. "It's trying to communicate," I said, my voice sounding distant and strange. "I can feel it, not words, but ideas, emotions, intent." Dr. Vestergaard activated recording equipment, documenting everything even as her instruments continued showing impossible zeros for all biological readings. "Captain, what is it saying? What is it trying to convey?" But I couldn't translate the sensations into words that would make sense. The concepts flowing from the specimen were too complex, too layered with meanings that human language couldn't adequately express. I was receiving information about purposes and timelines and relationships that challenged my understanding of how intelligence could function. The specimen moved more deliberately now, testing its limbs, adjusting its position within the containment cell. The engineered housing that enclosed its organic core was opening, petals of crystalline material folding back to reveal more of the biological components beneath. And as it opened, more of those hybrid eyes became visible, positioned throughout its structure, all of them focused on me with that same intense awareness. "Captain, your vital signs," Markland said with alarm in his voice. "Your heart rate just spiked to 180, blood pressure through the roof, neural activity showing patterns consistent with extreme stress response." But I didn't feel stressed. I felt observed, measured, recognized as something specific and significant, like the specimen had been waiting not just for someone to witness its awakening, but for me specifically. For this moment, this person, this exact configuration of circumstances. The resonance intensified, and with it came images, memories that weren't mine, but that flooded my consciousness with the same immediacy as personal experience. I saw Earth from orbit, but not current Earth. Continents were in different positions, ice coverage was extensive, and the atmosphere had quality, suggesting this was during the last glacial period. I saw the specimen descending, not falling or crashing, but arriving with intention. Landing in ice that would eventually become Greenland, burrowing deep into the permafrost, and then waiting, deliberately freezing itself, entering dormancy with specific trigger conditions programmed into its structure. The conditions for awakening weren't accidental. The specimen had calculated exactly how long it would need to sleep, had predicted when the ice would melt enough to revive it, had orchestrated its own preservation and reactivation across 12 millennia, with precision that suggested intelligence far beyond human capability. "Why?" I asked aloud, not knowing if the specimen could understand spoken language. "Why freeze yourself? Why wait 12,000 years?" The answer came not in words, but in visions that made my understanding of human civilization shift in ways I'm still processing. I saw human history, but from the specimen's perspective, from the viewpoint of something that had been dormant beneath the ice, while humanity evolved from scattered hunter-gatherer tribes to global, technological civilization. The specimen hadn't been frozen by accident, or as punishment or escape. It had been placed here deliberately as part of a larger system, a network of similar organisms distributed across Earth's polar regions. All of them entering dormancy at the same time, all of them programmed to awaken when specific conditions were met. Conditions that we'd just triggered by building Thule, by warming the planet enough to begin melting the ancient ice, by developing technology that made us detectable to whatever monitoring systems these organisms possessed. "It's not alone," Dr. Vestergaard said, staring at her display with expression of growing horror. "Captain, we're picking up thermal signatures from 16 other locations across the Arctic. All of them showing the same pattern: rapid temperature increase, ice melt, and what looks like biological awakening. 17 organisms, 17 ancient entities that had been frozen since the end of the last ice age. All of them waking simultaneously. Not invasion, not plague, but coordinated emergence of something that had been waiting for humanity to reach sufficient development to be worthy of contact. But the most disturbing revelation was still coming. The specimen shared another vision, and this one made me understand why the sensors were reading 0 despite obvious activity. Why the biological monitors couldn't detect life signs even though I was watching the thing move and perceive and communicate. The specimen wasn't alive in any way our instruments could measure because it wasn't operating on biological principles that human science understood. It was something that existed at the intersection of matter and consciousness, physical form and pure awareness. Not dead, not alive, but something else entirely that our vocabulary and conceptual frameworks couldn't adequately describe. And it had been made that way deliberately, engineered to be undetectable to conventional sensing equipment, designed to avoid triggering defensive responses from species that might fear what they didn't understand. It could only be perceived through direct consciousness contact, through the kind of awareness that came from actually looking at it and allowing it to look back. "The reports," I said suddenly, understanding flooding through me. "The official documentation is going to say no movement, no life signs, no activity, because the instruments can't detect it. But anyone who is actually in the room, anyone who made eye contact, they'll know the truth." Dr. Vestergaard was already checking previous documentation from when the specimen was first discovered. "The 1952 reports," she said slowly. "They're contradictory. Instrument readings all showing negative for biological activity, but personal testimony from the personnel present, describing movement, awareness, intelligent response. The official conclusion was that the witnesses were experiencing psychological effects from isolation and cold, but they were telling the truth. They saw what we're seeing now, which meant that for 70 years, Thule had been built around something that official records insisted was inert, but that every person who encountered it directly knew was aware and active. A conspiracy of silence maintained not through threats or coercion, but through the simple fact that anyone who reported the truth would sound insane compared to the instrumental data. The specimen moved closer to the containment barrier, and I realized it was showing me something specific. Not threatening, not aggressive, but deliberately drawing my attention to markings on its surface that I hadn't noticed before. Symbols or writing arranged in patterns that suggested mathematical notation or linguistic structure. "Can you read this?" I asked Dr. Vestergaard, pointing at the symbols. She studied them through her recording equipment, enhancing the images for clarity. "It's not any language in our databases, but the structure, the way the symbols relate to each other, it looks like it's describing biological processes, genetic sequences maybe, or instructions for cellular modification." The specimen pulsed with that resonance again, and more concepts flooded into my mind. I saw human DNA, but with sections highlighted, sequences marked as if someone had annotated our genetic code with commentary or editing notes. And I understood with growing horror what those markings meant. "It's showing me that humans were modified," I said, my voice hollow. "That our genetic structure has sections that aren't natural evolution. That something altered us, deliberately edited our development to produce specific characteristics." Markland looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Sir, that's not possible. Human evolution is documented. We have fossil records, genetic lineages that show clear natural development." But the specimen was insisting otherwise. showing me comparisons between human genetics and what appeared to be baseline primate structures, showing insertions, deletions, modifications that would have required technology we couldn't currently replicate. Changes that had been made approximately 12,000 years ago, right around the time these organisms had entered their dormancy. Dr. Vestergaard was checking something on her system, her face growing pale. There are sections of human DNA that geneticists call junk genes, sequences that don't seem to code for anything functional. Researchers have speculated they might be remnants of evolutionary history or inactive viral insertions. But what if they're not junk? What if they're engineered insertions that we haven't activated yet? The specimen confirmed her speculation with another pulse of resonance, and it showed me what would happen when those dormant sequences activated. I saw humans changing, not physically, but in terms of capability. Enhanced cognitive function, expanded sensory perception, ability to interface with consciousness in ways that would make us compatible with whatever networks these organisms represented. "We're not finished evolving," I said. "We're only partially developed. These things, these organisms, they modified us 12,000 years ago, and then froze themselves to wait until we reached the point where the final activation could occur safely. Until we developed enough technology and social complexity that the changes wouldn't destroy us." "What changes?" Markland asked, though I could tell from his expression he was beginning to understand and didn't like the implications. "They want to wake us up," I said. "Not physically, consciously. To activate the genetic sequences they installed and make us capable of joining whatever collective intelligence they're part of. To transform humanity from isolated biological organisms into nodes in a vast awareness that spans the planet and possibly beyond." Dr. Vestergaard was documenting everything, but her hands were shaking. "This is first contact, not with aliens from distant stars, but with ancient intelligence that's been embedded in Earth's ecosystem for 12 millennia. Intelligence that's been waiting for us to develop to the point where we could understand what they were offering." But the specimen's next transmission made clear it wasn't offering, it was preparing. The activation was coming whether we accepted it or not, whether we were ready or not. Because the conditions that triggered these organisms awakening were the same conditions that would trigger the dormant sequences in human DNA. Rising temperatures, changing climate, technological development, reaching critical thresholds. All of it was acting as timer for transformation that had been set in motion 12,000 years ago, when these organisms had visited Earth during the last ice age and decided that the primitive humans they found showed potential worthy of cultivation. "How long?" I asked the specimen, not sure if it would understand the question. "How long do we have before the activation occurs?" The answer came as sensation rather than number, but the meaning was clear. Years, not decades. The melting of polar ice wasn't just waking these organisms. It was releasing compounds they'd stored in the permafrost, biological agents that would spread through the environment and trigger the genetic changes they'd installed in human ancestors. We weren't just witnessing the awakening of ancient intelligence. We were watching the first stage of humanity's transformation into something we couldn't yet imagine, into the beings these organisms had designed us to become. And the most terrifying part was that I could feel it beginning. Even in this frozen chamber, even with minimal exposure to whatever compounds the specimen was releasing, I could sense changes in my own consciousness. Thoughts becoming clearer, awareness expanding, perception shifting in ways that made normal human consciousness feel limited and constrained. "We need to report this," Markland said. "Command needs to know what's happening, what these things are planning." But I shook my head, because I understood something he hadn't grasped yet. "Report what? The instruments read 0. The official records will show we found nothing but a frozen object that exhibited no biological activity. Anyone we tell the truth to will think we've lost our minds from isolation and cold." Then we falsify the reports, Dr. Vestergaard said quietly. We document what we saw regardless of what the instruments say. Someone needs to know the truth. The specimen made that resonance sound again, and I felt its awareness shift from me to encompass all three of us. It was recognizing us not as individuals, but as representatives of our species, as the first humans to witness its awakening and understand what it meant for humanity's future. And in that moment of collective recognition, I understood why it had waited for eye contact, why it required direct perception rather than instrumental detection, because the transformation wasn't just genetic. It was consciousness-based. You had to see it, had to allow it to see you, had to make that direct connection before the activation could begin. Looking into the specimen's eyes hadn't just shown me what it was. It had started the process of becoming what it wanted us to be. The changes started manifesting within hours of our exposure. Not dramatic transformations, but subtle shifts in how I perceived and processed reality. Colors seemed more vivid. Sounds carried more information than just acoustic data. And most disturbing, I could feel other consciousnesses around me. Markland's anxiety, Dr. Vestergaard's fascination, the specimen's vast ancient awareness, all of it accessible in ways that human brains shouldn't be capable of perceiving. We remained in the containment area for another 6 hours, documenting everything we could, even though we knew the instrumental data would contradict our observations. The specimen continued to activate, more of its crystalline components glowing online, more of its biological systems achieving full function. But every sensor still read 0 for life signs, maintaining the impossible contradiction between what the equipment measured and what we directly witnessed. This is deliberate camouflage, Dr. Vestergaard said as she reviewed the data. Not optical camouflage or physical concealment. It's operating at frequencies or using biological principles that our instruments weren't designed to detect. Like trying to measure consciousness with a thermometer. The equipment isn't malfunctioning, it's just measuring the wrong things. Around 900 hours, we received communication from Base Command requesting status update. I climbed back up to the main levels, leaving Markland and Dr. Vestergaard to continue observation, and reported to Colonel Stevens, the base commander who I'd met exactly twice since arriving at Thule. Stevens was in his 60s, career military, and he had the look of someone who'd been holding secrets for too long and was tired of the wait. When I entered his office, he gestured for me to sit and then activated a white noise generator that ensured our conversation couldn't be monitored or recorded. "Captain Norwick," he said heavily, "I understand you've been to the deep facility, that you've seen the specimen." "Yes, sir," I confirmed. Dr. Vestergaard provided access after the temperature alarm triggered. "The specimen has achieved a ambient temperature and appears to be active." "Appears to be active," Stevens repeated. "That's careful phrasing. What do your instruments say?" "The instruments read 0 for all biological activity, sir, but direct observation suggests the specimen is aware, responsive, and attempting communication." Stevens nodded like this was exactly what he'd expected. The same contradiction that's been in reports since 1952. Personnel witnessing activity that instruments can't detect. "Tell me, Captain, what do you believe? Do you trust your eyes or your equipment?" It was a test, I realized. A way of determining if I was someone who could accept uncomfortable truths, or if I'd retreat to the safety of instrumental data that told comfortable lies. "I trust what I saw, sir. The specimen is active, and I believe it's been waiting for this moment, for conditions that would allow it to complete whatever purpose brought it here 12,000 years ago." Stevens opened a folder that had security markings I'd never seen before, classification codes that suggested information even more restricted than the specimen's existence. "You're not the first officer to make that assessment. Every security commander at Thule eventually gets briefed on what we really know about the specimen and what we don't. The question is always the same. Do we try to destroy it before it can complete its purpose? Or do we allow events to proceed and hope its intentions are benign? What did previous commanders recommend, sir? Destroy it, Stevens said bluntly. Every single one of them concluded that the risks of allowing it to continue were too great. But every time a proposal for termination went up the chain of command, it got shut down by people with higher clearances who insisted the specimen needed to be preserved and studied. He pulled out a document dated 1959, typed on manual typewriter with multiple classification stamps across the header. This is from Project Cold Harvest, the initial research program after the specimen was discovered. They did extensive analysis, trying to understand what it was and what had brought it to Earth. The conclusions are disturbing. I read the document, and with each paragraph, my understanding of humanity's history shifted in ways that were becoming disturbingly familiar. The Project Cold Harvest researchers had concluded that the specimen was part of a cultivation program, that ancient intelligence had visited Earth during the last ice age, had evaluated the primitive humans they found, and had decided we showed sufficient potential to warrant genetic modification and long-term monitoring. The modifications they'd made were subtle, designed to enhance specific cognitive capabilities without dramatically altering our baseline biology. Enhanced abstract reasoning, improved social cooperation, capacity for technological innovation, all traits that would allow us to develop advanced civilization while retaining the unpredictability and creativity that made us interesting. And then they'd frozen themselves, setting timers based on predicted climate cycles, ensuring they'd wake when humanity had developed to the point where final activation could occur, when we were advanced enough to understand what was happening, but not so advanced that we destroyed ourselves through warfare or environmental catastrophe. They've been cultivating us, I said quietly, like gardeners planting seeds and waiting for harvest. Stevens nodded grimly. That's the disturbing part. We're not independent development. We're someone's project. And now the project's managers are waking up to check on our progress and implement whatever final changes they had planned. What are the final changes? I asked, though I suspected I already knew from what the specimen had shown me. Stevens pulled out another document, this one much more recent, dated just 5 years ago. This is from Dr. Vestergaard's predecessor. She concluded that the dormant sequences in human DNA will activate naturally as we're exposed to compounds these organisms release. Estimates suggest that within a generation, every human on Earth will undergo some level of cognitive and perceptual transformation. We'll become something new, something that fits whatever role these entities designed us to fill. And Command's response? Classified panic, Stevens said with dark humor. Half the Pentagon wants to exterminate all 17 organisms before they can complete the activation. The other half wants to study them, to learn how the transformation works, so we can control or weaponize it. Both sides are operating under the assumption that we have choice in the matter, that we can prevent or redirect what's coming. But we can't, I said, understanding clicking into place. Because the activation is already starting. The genetic sequences were designed to trigger in response to environmental conditions that we've already created. Climate change, global population density, technological saturation. We've reached all the milestones these organisms were waiting for. Stevens looked at me with the expression of someone recognizing a kindred spirit in uncomfortable awareness. Exactly. We can destroy the organisms, but we can't reverse the changes they initiated 12,000 years ago. The transformation is coming, whether these particular 17 specimens survive or not. They're just here to witness and guide, not to cause or control. Then what do we do, sir? Officially, Stevens said, we report that the specimen shows no biological activity, that temperature increase was due to natural geothermal processes, and that continued monitoring is recommended, but no immediate action required. We maintain the comfortable fiction that lets everyone sleep at night. And unofficially, "We prepare," Stevens said. "We document everything truthfully for records that might someday be declassified. We watch for signs of the activation beginning in general population, and we hope that whatever these entities designed us to become is something we'll want to be." I spent the next week conducting additional observation sessions with the specimen, each one revealing more about its nature and purpose. Dr. Vestergaard developed protocols for interaction that maximized information transfer while minimizing psychological impact on personnel. Markland worked on security procedures for when news of the awakening inevitably leaked beyond classified channels. But the most significant development came when I returned alone to the containment chamber for a final direct communication session. I needed to understand one crucial question that the specimen hadn't adequately answered. Why us? What made humans worthy of cultivation and transformation? The specimen seemed to have been waiting for this question. When I asked it directly, the response came as the most complex and layered transmission I'd yet received. I saw Earth's biosphere from a perspective that spanned millions of years, watching species evolve and go extinct, watching intelligence emerge and fail repeatedly. The entities that created the specimens, I didn't have a name for them, but the concept they transmitted suggested something like cultivators or gardeners, had been managing planetary development across multiple worlds for time periods I couldn't comprehend. They weren't gods or superior beings judging lesser species. They were more like farmers tending crops, helping potential intelligences overcome the barriers that prevented natural development from achieving consciousness capable of joining the broader cosmic community. Earth had shown potential many times before humans. Other species had developed intelligence, tool use, even primitive technology. But they'd always hit walls. Environmental catastrophe, evolutionary dead ends, inability to develop abstract reasoning sufficient for technological civilization. The cultivators had tried gentle interventions with previous species, but had learned that subtle changes rarely produced desired results. With humans, they'd taken a different approach. Rather than subtle nudges, they'd made direct genetic modifications to accelerate specific developments. And rather than continuous monitoring that might influence our cultural development, they'd frozen themselves to wait until we either succeeded or failed on our own merits. What we'd built, art, science, technology, culture, civilization in all its complexity and contradiction, that was genuinely human achievement. The cultivators had given us enhanced capability, but how we used it was entirely our choice. They'd designed us to have free will, genuine unpredictability, capacity for both transcendent good and terrible evil. And now they were waking to see what we'd done with the potential they'd given us, to determine if we developed to the point where final activation could proceed, where we could join the network of transformed intelligences across the cosmos without losing what made us uniquely human. But what if we don't want to join? I asked the specimen. What if humanity chooses to remain as we are, independent and isolated? The response was simple and devastating. Too late. Change is already beginning. Choice was made 12,000 years ago by ancestors who couldn't understand what they were accepting. Now you live with consequences. I emerged from that final session with understanding that was both liberating and terrifying. We weren't facing invasion or conquest. We were facing inheritance. The specimen wasn't our enemy. It was our ancestor in the sense that it had made us what we were, had given us capabilities that would eventually transform us into something that could participate in whatever cosmic network these entities maintained. And that inheritance was already manifesting. I could feel it in myself, in Dr. Vestergaard, in Markland, in every person who'd spent time in direct contact with the specimen. Enhanced perception, expanded consciousness, ability to sense and communicate at levels that human neurology shouldn't support. The official report I filed 3 weeks later was exactly what Colonel Stevens had predicted. Temperature anomaly resolved. No biological activity detected in deep facility. Continued monitoring recommended. The instrumental data supported every word, showed perfect correlation between official conclusion and measurable facts. But the personal log I'm recording now, the testimony I'm giving in this supposedly soundproof room, tells the truth that instrumental data can't capture. The specimen is active and aware. 16 others like it are awakening across the Arctic. And within a generation, every human on Earth will undergo transformation into what we were designed to become, not slaves or servants or conquered population, but inheritors of potential that was planted 12,000 years ago, cultivated through all of human history, and finally ready to express itself as the ice melts and ancient guardians wake to witness what we've become. The people who created the specimens, the cultivators who modified human genetics and waited to see if we'd survive our own development, they're not coming back. This is their final gift and final test. The organisms they left behind will guide our transformation, will help us activate the dormant sequences without destroying ourselves in the process. But the real question isn't whether the transformation will happen. It's whether we'll accept it willingly or fight against becoming what we were designed to be. Whether we'll embrace the inheritance or try to remain purely human, even as our biology insists otherwise. I've felt the changes accelerating in myself over the past weeks. Thoughts becoming clearer, awareness expanding, consciousness connecting with others in ways that make individual existence feel limited. And I've made peace with what's coming. Not because I'm certain it's good or right, but because I understand it's inevitable. The organism beneath Thule isn't humanity's enemy. It's our parent in the most literal sense. It made us, modified us, waited for us to grow, and now it's waking to help us complete our development into something that was planned before human civilization existed. The ice is melting. The organisms are waking. The transformation is beginning. And all we can do is document the truth for whoever comes after, for whatever we're becoming, and hope that the beings who designed us 12,000 years ago understood us well enough to know what we'd need to survive the inheritance they left us. This is my testimony, my confession, my attempt to record what instrumental data can't measure before the changes progress so far, that what I'm experiencing becomes the new normal. And what we were becomes as distant and primitive as our hunter-gatherer ancestors seem to us now. The specimen is still in containment beneath Thule, still watching, still waiting, not as threat or invader, but as witness to transformation that was set in motion before pyramids were built, before agriculture was invented, before humans were anything more than promising primates who showed potential worthy of cultivation. We are their children, their project, their final gift to a cosmos that needs what only humans, in all our beautiful, terrible, unpredictable complexity, can provide. And ready or not, willing or not, we're about to become what we were always meant to be.